contract breakdown and speculation. Today we're going to be talking about the Los Angeles Rams. The Rams are a team that used to be near and dear to my heart. I'm born and raised in St. Louis, and I was a fan pretty much my entire life until they obviously packed up and left. So it was tough. I break that down in the article. You can read about my struggles as a Rams fan. But today what we're going to be talking about mainly are 3 contract extensions that we're watching, or new contracts that we're going to be watching. First up is going to be Malcolm Brown. So Malcolm Brown, not really a big name. Everybody knows who he is. He's the Rams' third-string running back. He was running back 44 in 2020, so nothing too great there. 7.2 fantasy points per game. That's below average from what we would expect. He's not a very reliable starter at all for you last year. He could have maybe found his way onto the bench, and he was almost 100% owned. So obviously he should have been rostered on your team, but he just wasn't able to be trusted week in, week out. What's odd is that he was the second-ranked running back for the Rams, partially due to Cam Akers, not playing much in the first half of the year. He kind of picked it up towards the end. And then obviously going into 2021, I expect Akers to see the majority of the carries, even with Henderson still there. So he made $1.6 million last year. I expect that to go up, maybe just a tad. What I'm expecting really is Mike Davis type money. So Mike Davis made $3 million for 1 year. I actually kind of like that as a comp too. They're very similar sizes, same style running back. Both kind of have a nose for the end zone. Davis stepped in. He did pretty decent for McCaffrey. He's obviously not McCaffrey, but he did decent this year. I'd say he did about 50-60% of what Christian can do, and I see that similar role for Brown if he switches teams. So I think best case scenario, you're going to find him as an RB2 on the team, and really he's there in case the main running back gets injured. So he's a hold at the moment. Just wait for news to come out. Obviously, I'll update everybody whenever we get an update. Next up is Gerald Everett. Like Brown, Everett had a pretty poor season. Let's see what he finished at. He finished at tight end 24, which in this tight end wasteland that we have in fantasy football this year, that's pretty bad. Higbee, his counterpart tight end, finished 17, which is also pretty poor. It makes sense. The breakdown does. Higbee gets paid quite a bit more, so it makes sense that he's the one that touches the ball more. Either way, very disappointing for both. So Everett's technically a value with what he was getting paid. He made right at $1.5 million for last year. So that was a value. I mean, he wasn't reliable to start. I wrote about Christian Kirk in last week's article, and I kind of see them similar. They're both rostered. They need to be rostered, but you can't. I mean, you're not going to trust to start him each week. Maybe in the bench spot, but even then, it would have been tough. So he only had 3 games above 10 fantasy points. His highest total on the year was 13 fantasy points in a single game. So he's a hold. Hopefully he can find his way out of LA. Can make it to a team with a tight end void. That's going to be his best option. Once he starts to get into the $4 or $5 million range, if that's what he starts to get into next year in his new contract, that's going to be a little bit tougher to roster. So we'll keep our eye on it and see what's going to happen. Last one we're going to talk about is Josh Reynolds. So Reynolds is a tough case for a few reasons. One is that he's got 2 stud receivers in front of him, Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods, and neither of them are going anywhere next year. So if he comes back to Los Angeles, it's going to be very tough for him to find his way, to solid fantasy production. His only real option for us to keep rostering him is going to be finding his way out. I think if he goes somewhere else and it's the right spot, he could break out as a number 2 somewhere. I really see him as an underrated receiver for pretty much his whole career. I mean, he hasn't been great, but he hasn't really gotten the opportunity either. So if he finds his way to a team like Green Bay or like a Houston, I see him taking over that number 2 wide receiver role. Maybe not in Green Bay. Lazard still might have that, but we don't know what's going to happen with him next season either. So just something to think about. I see him as talented enough to be a wide receiver 2 on one of those type teams. What I'm looking for his contract is similar to a Keelan Cole type contract. Keelan had 1 year, $3.2 million. I think that's probably about right. Maybe a little bit less. He might be in the mid to, $2.5 million, right around there when he finally does get a contract. So I would buy him for cheap. I wouldn't, give a lot to get him. But what you can do is say you have a deal on the table and you don't think it's close to enough, or it might be right on the edge, or maybe you just want to get a little more out of it. You say, hey, you have Reynolds, toss him in, and we got a deal, something like that. So I think there is quite a bit of upside, especially with the contract that you would have to take on just for a few more months until he signs a new one. So what we're going to get into now is a little bit of contract breakdown. So these two players I'm going to talk about, they're not expiring contracts. Their contracts are still good. But what we're going to do is talk about them and see what kind of value we can get out of it. I'm going to go to my article here for a few of the numbers. So first one we're talking about is Robert Woods. Woods is a solid wide receiver too. He finished 13 on the year. He's 20 years old. His contract that's going to be expiring in 2022 is 1 year, $6.8 million. So that's a pretty good value for a player like him. When you're finishing wide receiver 13, it's actually pretty quiet finish to the season. To be honest with you, if I'd have taken a guess, I would guess somewhere around wide receiver 15 to 20. So 13 is very very solid for where you drafted him and his contract amount. What we're going to look at here is comparison to his peers. What I'm looking at here is all rosterable wide receivers that are between $6 million and $8 million. Rosterable, it's a subjective term, so it's kind of at my discretion what I wanted to include. But these are all the players that I consider that they could possibly be rostered in Dynasty Owner. And we see that Woods is by far the most productive over the past 2 years. 2019, 232 points. 2020, 243 points. Nobody's really close to that. The closest one, I guess, would be, let's see here, Parker. Edelman would have been close if he could have stayed healthy this year. He'd probably been close, but Parker's the closest. That's really it. Beasley had a couple good years, but nothing close to what Roberts put up for the past two. And if you look, he's also one of the few on here that still has a contract in place. So we got Jones expiring, Rashard Perriman, Corey Davis, Willie Snead. They're all expiring at the end of the year. $6.8 million. It's a very fair price to pay for what you're getting out of him. And then I go down to talk about him compared to these players, what their ages are, and then we break down his first 5 seasons versus next 3 seasons. So you can read it. I'm not going to list it off, but needless to say, he averaged quite a bit more in his last 3 seasons than in his first 5. And this brings up a good point that I wanted to mention, and I talk about it pretty good in the article here, is what I like to call a second contract sweet spot. So what the second contract sweet spot is, I define it as a player is old enough to have made it past his first contract, but he was not so productive in that first contract that he demanded top, wide receiver money. It's a little hard to understand. Let me try to break it down. So the way I compare him is to Devontae Parker. So Woods, he played for the Bills. We all know he played for the Bills first 4 years. He was average, maybe a little bit below average for his first 2 years. He didn't get enough production through those first 4 years to demand a high contract, 12 million, 13, 14, 15 million. Because of that, he got paid 6.8. And it's not great news for him because he's making less money, obviously, but it's good news for us because he is giving you the production of a close to a wide receiver 1 for a wide receiver 3, maybe a high wide receiver 3 money. And so that's what that second contract sweet spot is. If he'd have performed any better in Buffalo for those first 3-4 years, we would be talking about $12 million a year. So he's a great value, one of the best values, to be honest with you, on Dynasty, especially for wide receivers. Now we're going to talk about Jared Goff. So let me bring up my numbers here again. Jared Goff, he's another tough case. So he's 26 years old. We all know that he agreed to a 4 years, $33.5 million per year contract extension in 2019. He was QB 18 last year. That's not good value. It's actually very poor. And obviously, he's not given the numbers that we need to provide that value. I think what's going on, he got that contract for 2 main reasons. One, he was the first overall pick. We know that he's the first overall pick. So that's going to demand, at some level, some more money, unless he completely fall off a cliff, in his first 4 years. And then he also had a great 2018 season where he took the Rams to the Super Bowl. And let me pull up his numbers here. So right here we see he set career highs in team record, 13-3. This is in 2018. Passing yards, almost 4,700. Touchdowns, 32. And QBR of 101.1. All great numbers. I mean, it looked like a lot. He got $33.5 million. Why wouldn't he? You know, he's one of the top performing quarterbacks at the time. The problem is that since then he has underperformed fantasy wise. I wouldn't necessarily say real world football wise, but he, I don't know, the Rams just took on a different persona. They like to run the ball more. Goff has maybe become a little more inconsistent over the past couple of years, and we saw in 2018. It's really been frustrating, to be honest with you. And we can take a look. I compared him to his peers the same way I did to Woods. So these are all the rosterable quarterbacks between 19 million and 35 million. Obviously, you see Russ at the top and Aaron. But what's interesting is you look at the fantasy points for 2020, and Goff isn't close. He really isn't. The closest we have is Wentz, and I shouldn't probably even include Wentz on this list. I did just because he played the majority of the games for the year. But we know he wasn't even the starter, towards the end. So 305, and you compare that to all these top other wide. I mean, even look at Kirk Cousins. So 406, Cousins beat him by over 100 points, which is odd because he's only rostered in 3%. He's rostered in 10% less leagues. So Goff, 13% rostered. I think that's actually too high for being such a low number. It's just a tough value. And I wrote in here that anybody that rostered Goff in 2020 probably didn't win their league. I mean, if you rostered him the whole season, he was just a big void for your cap space. And I'd be surprised if somebody recovered from that big loss. But that's what it is. He'd be an amnesty candidate for sure if I owned him. And it's kind of strange. It's like I was talking with Robert Woods about the sweet spot. Goff is kind of the anti-sweet spot. He overperformed. He performed very well in the seasons right up before his contract, got paid, but then a combination of a bunch of different things, his pace has really slowed down, and his fantasy points have been quite poor for the past couple of years. So anyway, this was my video. Make sure you check out the article. It'll be up on Wednesday when this video comes out. So all my videos and articles will be released on Wednesdays. Check out everybody else's work on Dynasty Owner. You can follow me on Twitter. You got my name right down there at Dynasty Jerk. And then obviously follow everybody else, all the other article writers that we have. They're all doing a real good job to provide you some good content for the year. And I'm really excited about the stuff that we got going for Dynasty Owner in the offseason. We got a lot more surprises for y'all. So stick with us. It's going to be a good offseason. Hope to see y'all soon.